Here's a guy who doesn't understand how science works.
I actually agree with atheists on one major point, that there is zero scientific evidence for God's existence, and frankly, there never will be.
Of course there won't. I don't recognize the most common definitions of God that apologists and theologians use as even being coherent. I don't see how you could give any kind of evidence of an incoherent claim.
This may surprise you because I'm a Christian theist, but it shouldn't. If this sounds counterintuitive, it's not your fault. It's because we've all been conditioned by a culture that obsesses over the fruits of knowledge, data, and technology, while ignoring the roots of knowledge, epistemology.
The epistemology that gave you those fruits is methodological naturalism. How many modern technologies were invented with prayer or magical incantations?
Okay, well, how would you prove God then? To do it, you have to stop looking at the roof and start looking at the foundation. Today, I'm going to show you this architecture of knowledge that science relies upon but cannot prove.
An architecture of knowledge is not a claim. You can't prove it because it doesn't say anything. The scientific method doesn't claim to yield truth. We use it because it gets us ideas that consistently seem to work. It produces ideas with practical applications. Theists use an epistemology that is circular and useless.
By the way, I'm Dr. Derek. I have a PhD in philosophy. I used to be an atheist, and this stuff is all I do all day long. All right, let's dive in. Now, this category error has a name. It's called scientism. It's the belief that science is the only way, or perhaps the best way, to know truth.
That's not an assumption that atheists who understand the philosophy of science make. Knowing the truth is not the point of science. In A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking said that a scientific theory exists only in our minds and does not have any other reality, whatever that might mean. The point of science is to come up with models of what we observe that allow us to consistently predict future observations. Maybe all of our observations are one big consistent illusion. As long as scientific models continue to consistently predict the apparent behavior of the illusion, the fact that it's an illusion, if that's what it happens to be, is of no practical consequence.
And I'm sorry to say, scientism is wrong. Now, if some internet apologist told you that, you probably would roll your eyes. And frankly, you probably should. But what if a Nobel Prize winner told you that?
Then I'd be even more skeptical. Nobel Prize winners are notorious for being skilled in the subject in which they won their prize and saying absurd things about subjects outside of their expertise. It's called Nobel disease. They don't give a Nobel Prize in philosophy, so even as an argument from authority this doesn't work because he's not an authority on the subject of epistemology.
Sir Peter Medawar won a Nobel Prize in medicine. He admitted that science is technically helpless when it comes to answering questions like, what is the point of living?
Nothing can, because the question is loaded with an assumption that isn't true. And theism can't tell us, at least not in a non-circular way, why we ought to serve God's purposes.
Or Thomas Nagel, one of the most famous atheist philosophers alive. He wrote an entire book dismantling the idea that physics can explain everything.
It doesn't claim to, and theism also can't explain everything. Nagel's main point of contention with materialism is what some philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, which is not really a thing.
One time I had a very interesting discussion with Tom Nagel about this. Tom, who wrote What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he said, well, neuroscience could give you perfect correlation between brain events and conscious events, but it wouldn't explain the correlation. And I said, okay, let's explore that. Can you give me an example where it's not just correlation? And he said, yes. Chemists, physicists can tell you, as it were, why water is wet. The molar macro property of wetness can be explained, not just correlated with, but explained in terms of the bonds of the water molecules and so forth. I said, okay, good. That's an example of explanatory correlation. I said, now, how about when industrial chemists create a new polymer that's never been seen on the globe before? It's an artificial polymer. And before they've even made it, they're telling you what its tensile strength is, what its color is, whether it's going to be brittle or stretchy, and so forth. I said, you know, they can do that sometimes. I said, would that be explanatory? And he said, yes. I said, okay, well, I think we've already entered the age of explanatory neuroscience. And I showed him the Ramachandran and Gregory motion capture experiment, where they predicted a brand new illusion that had never been seen anywhere before, And they predicted it on the basis of their knowledge of the organization of the visual cortex in terms of the blobs and the interblobs, and the parts that are motion sensitive and the parts that are have a low spatial resolution. And I said, isn't that exactly analogous to what the chemists do? Namely, these folks knew enough about how the brain worked so they could say, we'll prove that we know how the brain works because we will put together a circumstance which creates an illusion never before seen, and we'll predict it in advance. Yeah. So, I mean, that's why I think there's no hard problem.
Or Jaron Lanier, the father of virtual reality, who warned us that treating humans like data is a wrong approach.
To what? And who treats humans like data? Scientists who study humans collect data about them. That's not the same as treating them like data.
The solution is to double down on being human. Schrodinger, Penrose, Chomsky, Wittgenstein, these aren't Christian apologists. These are the architects of the modern world. Again, none of them are religious. Even they are telling you, don't forget the foundation.
The foundation is empiricism, because the whole point of learning anything about anything is to be able to predict future observations and experiences, or at least to investigate whether they can be predicted.
So I want to show you what they see. I want to show you the architecture of knowledge that science relies upon but cannot prove. Science can explain gravity, atoms, and stars, but there's one thing, among many, that science cannot explain. It can't explain itself.
Yes, it can. Historiography is a science that can explain quite thoroughly how science as a practice came to exist.
To understand why, we have to look at the bedrock. This bedrock is made of things like the law of non-contradiction. It's a simple rule that says both A and not A cannot be true at the same time and in the same sense. An 8-ball can be both black and white, but it can't be black all over and white all over at the same time. It's impossible. Now here's the question that breaks scientism. Can you prove this law of non-contradiction using science?
No, but you can't prove it using theism either. Even if there's a God, there's no way to prove that no contradictions are or ever will be true. The reason I believe in the law of non-contradiction is because I don't understand what it would even mean for a contradiction to be true. It doesn't follow from the fact that we can't understand what it would mean for the law of non-contradiction to be false, that it therefore can't be false. That would be the case even if there's a God.
Of course not, because you would have to use the law in order to try to prove the law, and that's circular reasoning. It's like trying to lift yourself up by your own shoelaces. You can pull as hard as you want, but you're not going anywhere. And using the law of non-contradiction is not using science, it's using logic, which is not science.
Yes, it is. It's what's called a formal science.
This is the tension. We're not wrong to use science. The mistake is thinking that science is the only thing in the room.
It's the only thing in the room that can most effectively help me predict observation and experience, and that's the only epistemic virtue I see any reason to care about.
Think of it like a computer or a smartphone. Science is a brilliant app like Photoshop or Excel. Logic is the operating system. You can't run an app without the operating system already in place, and you can't use the calculator app to try to prove the IOS. The IOS has to be there first. By the way, this is partly why so many debates in my comment section turn into a war zone. One side is arguing about the app, quoting data and studies, and the other side is arguing for the operating system. They aren't even speaking the same language. But even if we agree on the operating system, surely we can trust the raw data, right? Well, that's actually the second trap. So the OS logic is running, and we aren't wrong to use the apps, science, but in order for the apps to work, we have to input data. And this brings us to our second level of the architecture, the reliability of the senses. Right now, you believe you're watching a video. You believe your eyes are telling you the truth. You believe the external world is real. But here's the problem, science can't prove any of those things.
Nor can theism. Maybe we're living in some kind of illusion. Even if there's a God, I don't see how that could be ruled out. However, if it's the case that we're living in some kind of illusion, science has helped us navigate this illusion more effectively than theism has.
How do you know that you're not just a brain in a vat, being fed these electrical signals made to simulate that you're watching a video?
Even if there's a God, how would you know that's not the case?
Let's say you use the tools of science, maybe a microscope or a scanner. I don't know why you would use a microscope, but let's just go with it. In reality, if you are in a simulation, you'd be using a simulated microscope to test whether you're in that simulation and you can start to see the problem. You'd be trapped in the loop. In order to do any science at all, we, both atheist and Christian, have to make massive assumptions.
No, we don't. When science makes models and comes up with theories of how things work, the point of doing so is not to find out what things really are. The point is to find a model that can be used to most effectively predict experience. We don't need to assume that our experiences are accurate because that's irrelevant. The point is merely to predict experience, not to find out whether our experiences are real or not. Whether our experiences are real only matters insofar as their reality or unreality has consequences for how those experiences occur.
We have to assume that the universe is intelligible.
No, we don't. Part of what science investigates is whether any particular phenomenon is intelligible. It makes no prior assumption whatsoever about its intelligibility. One of my favorite sci-fi novels is Solaris. It's about scientists who try to figure out some theory or model to predict the behavior of an ocean on a distant planet. Every hypothesis they test ends up being falsified, and it doesn't look as though the ocean's behavior is intelligible. Even if there are no theories that can adequately explain the ocean, testing hypotheses that all get falsified by experiment is still science. The scientists are still doing science on this ocean, even if it is, in fact, unintelligible.
We have to assume that the external world is real.
No, we don't. Even if there is no noumenal reality and we live in some kind of idealist universe, we can still do science and try to model this fake universe in a way that allows us to effectively predict its behavior.
That their senses aren't deceiving us.
Nope. If our senses are deceiving us, we can still come up with and test hypotheses about how these deceptive experiences work to try to predict what the next deceptive observation will be. Even if all of our senses are completely unreliable, we can still do science.
That the future will be like the past.
That's not an assumption. This guy seems to be trying to frame an inductive inference as being the same thing as an assumption. It's not.
Can't prove these things, we trust them.
I don't at all trust that my senses are accurate or that I'm not a brain in a vat. As long as I'm able to navigate the experiences I'm having, whether they are real is of no consequence whatsoever. So I don't have to trust that they are. It makes no difference whether they're real or not.
And by the way, this means that the strict materialist isn't just operating on pure evidence, they're operating on a kind of faith. It's a reasonable faith, it's an assumption, but it's still a kind of faith.
Apologists love to conflate inductive inference with faith. I think they do this to try to legitimize faith as an epistemological tool. They hold faith to be a virtue, so they try to conflate it with inductive inference because that's what science uses, and they want their epistemological approach to be as esteemed as science is.
Now, as for introspection, we could spend an entire video just on consciousness, the fact that you're aware of the screen. But let's not get too sidetracked. Let's just assume that you are conscious and we'll move on. So we have the OS logic, we trust the senses, the raw data. Now we step onto the floor. And this is where a very common sleight of hand usually happens. It's where observation gets rebranded as just science. To see the difference, imagine that you're holding an apple and you drop it. What just happened? The floor of our structure is very simple. The apple fell. That is an observation. It's raw data. A baby can see it. A dog can see it. You don't need a PhD in science in order to observe that. At this point, you're not doing science quite yet. But here's the thing. If I asked you why it fell, you'd of course say gravity. But notice what just happened. You stopped talking about the observation and you started talking about the explanation.
Yeah, but you inferred the explanation from the observation.
You move from the floor to the roof. Gravity isn't a basic fact in the same way that a falling apple is. Gravity is a theory, a mathematical model that we constructed to explain the fact, the raw datum. You can see the apple fall, but you can't see gravity because it's not an observation. You can only see what it does. And this is the most important thing I'll say in this entire video. Theists and atheists stand on the same floor. They see the same stars. They see the same fossils. They see the same cancer cells. The debate is never about the actual raw input. And contrary to popular belief, we usually accept the same scientific theories, the roof. I accept gravity. I accept evolution. I accept the Big Bang. So the debate isn't about the science. It's about the structural integrity of this thing. It's not about fighting over the roof, it's about investigating the blueprints. It's about asking what are the necessary logical tools required to build that roof, and do we have those in our inventory? But we still have a problem. We have the floor, the apple fell, and we have the roof, general relativity, but how do you get from one to the other? How do you get from a finite number of apples falling, which are just facts, to a universal invisible law of gravity, which is a model?
You come up with a hypothesis based on the observations, you calculate what observable consequences would result if the model were true, then you test whether you can, in fact, observe those consequences. General relativity is based on the observation that the speed of light seems to be the same in all reference frames. If general relativity is true, an implication of its truth is that gravitational lensing would exist. Arthur Eddington decided to test relativity by looking for gravitational lensing, and he found it.
You can't just jump from the floor to the roof, the gap is too wide. And if you just stack up facts, you don't get science. You just get a pile of facts. So to build the roof, you need pillars. You need specific binding agents to allow you to turn data into scientific theories. These pillars or binding agents have names: induction, abduction, testimony, and memory. These are the tools that allow us to predict the future, to trust our memory, and to infer the best explanation. And here's the reality. Most people, whether they're religious or not, have never looked at these tools. They just take the roof for granted. But if you want to be a serious thinker, you can't just inherit the house. You got to know how it's built. Now, you probably clicked this video because you want to know how to prove God. The answer might surprise you. The answer is you use the exact same tools we use to prove gravity. There is no magic religious logic. There's just logic.
How do you use logic and reasoning to prove the existence of a self-contradictory being? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.